Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our session, our last session of the day today, I guess, which is belonging in the workplace, a map for success. And I'm Krista Carr. I am the Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada and a member of the Disability and Work Steering Committee. And it's my privilege today to turn you over to your very capable moderator, who is Mike Sear, who is the National Program Manager at the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, CCRW. And Mike will moderate this session today, and I will jump back in when the panelists are finished and I'll moderate the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mike.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. I've learned a lot personally. I hope you've enjoyed yourself as well. For the last session today, we will have a nice conversation, and I just want to explain some concept before we get started so you have an idea of what we'll be talking about. We have some amazing panelists that we chose to be here with us today. There'll be a lot of discussion in regards to belonging in the workplace. And it's critical for employment and success, and also for organizational success, for individuals to feel that they belong. So I put some thought into this before the session started, and I do have some stories that I would like to share. We have Elvin here, first of all, that I will introduce you joining us. Elvin works for, or is part of a team that was working for Parks and Rec in the Forestry division. We also have another panelist with us, Lorene, Bodiam. And I thought that they would be great representatives, sharing examples from what they've done and what they've done to be successful. Elvin working within the community. And Lorene can speak to what she did to help individuals feel belonging and participate. So we've got a couple different perspectives, which is why I invited them both here. And we also have Daniel Samosh with us today, who's the assistant professor at Queen's University. I thought that would be great for myself because I actually have worked with all three of them before. So and then our paths crossed again. So I thought these would be wonderful perspectives for all of us, for those in the audience to listen and learn, and then bring what we've learned back to your workplace and invest in making your workplace a place where people feel belong and building those relationships. So before we get started, I will explain a little bit about what the screen looks like. So I am deaf, using a sign language interpreter. There'll be two interpreters today, so you'll see them switching on and off screen. Please be patient as that's happening. Elvin, Lorene, and Dan will also be taking turns speaking today as well. So now we'll get started. And before we get into the discussion of belonging, which is an important conversation, I want to look at the beginning. We know that there's no magic answer, that someone's not going to show up at your workplace magically and everything's going to work well. Everyone's gone through a journey to get to that workplace. So we thought it would be a good place to start today with hiring. So if we could, I'm thinking specifically for Elvin and Lorene. So if we could start with Lorene, if you can please tell us about your experience, how you chose Elvin to be part of the community. Thank you, Lorene. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel today. As the former advocate for people with disabilities and launching a new first ever done in Canada research project, I felt it was important that the research person I was hiring be someone with a disability. This seemed very obvious to me. However, when I approached my HR department They highly discouraged me from doing this. Now, this is a number of years ago. So maybe we were forging new pathways, but nonetheless, I was shocked. So I then conducted the corporate HR department, who actually commented on and complimented me on taking the initiative. And they wished more managers were doing just that. I went back to my department after I had had the conversation with the corporate office and informed them of their encouragement. And they informed me, my department informed me, that if I was going to go ahead and do this, and I ran into any problems at all, they would not be there to support me in any way. Despite the lack of support, I decided it was the right thing to do and proceeded to advertise for someone with a disability. I had set up in our database a number, over 200 organizations and agencies that had worked in the disability field. So I had a network that I could send out to. When Elvin, I didn't know, who would be coming to the interview, but I invited the HR department to be part of the process so that they could learn what it would be like to interview people with disabilities. Elvin was the successful candidate, and when he was the successful candidate, I needed to figure out how I was going to facilitate an office for him that would work so that he could do the job. And this meant that I needed a JAWS screen reader software for the computer. It meant I needed to get a Braille printer and a scanner. Although the initial cost for this was not in a budget, and it was, significant money at the time, I have to say that the value of having someone with a disability on staff definitely exceeded time and time again any initial cost for equipment. Before Elvin came into the office, I put him in touch with another colleague I knew in the corporation who was blind. This was in order for Elvin to be able to ask any questions about the corporate culture, and it provided a sense of familiarity and insight into how to navigate the processes in the city. And it gave him someone he could connect with right away, a sense of belonging, a sense of comfort. I also found it helpful myself to attend a conference to learn more about the world of blindness, because I knew very little about it, and how to work with someone who was blind. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Lorene. That was a wonderful explanation for us. Thank you. Now we would like to hear your perspective, Elvin, on going through that process.
Hey, thanks, Mike, and thanks so much for the chance to be a panelist on this very important topic. When I was hired originally under an Ontario Works grant to assist with a research project that explored the parks and recreational service delivery expectations of people with disabilities in Toronto, as well as to learn a little more about the demographic makeup of the community. The consultation process was quite extensive and included a survey that went out to people with disabilities in both hard copy, and it was also available online, a survey to disability service agencies, and 2 focus groups, one for the public and one for Parks, Forestry, and Recreation Division staff. As Lorene said, the study was the first of its kind that we are aware of in Canada. And if any of you are interested in learning more about the research project, you can find the report on the Parks, Forestry and Recreation website at www.toronto.ca/parks/accessibility. After the completion of the project, I was asked to stay on, and my job developed further to where I became the go-to person to test documents and potential website content for their compatibility with the JAWS screen reader for both divisional and corporate applications. I also have a Braille printer in my office. I'm one of the few people in the city that has one of those. And I've been asked a few times throughout the years to print off some documents. One example of this happened during my second year on the job. A blind person was starting a new job at one of our community centers in a different part of the city, and she needed two copies of a technical manual to be put into Braille. We were able to do this and send it to her within a couple of days. She was actually quite impressed that we were able to do it so quickly, and commented on how to get her son's report card in Braille, it often took more than 2 months. In fact, she put Lorene and I's name forward to attend a employee recognition luncheon at City Hall. So that was quite a positive experience for both of us. And when I was hired, Lorene actually arranged for an educational lunch and learn for office staff here on sighted guiding, guiding somebody who is blind. It was done, the person who did it was my orientation and mobility instructor from CNIB. It was offered at no cost, and it was received very positively. Staff appreciated the opportunity to be part of this 2 sessions. And they commented on how it helped to reduce fears and make them feel more comfortable, both guiding someone who is blind and also interacting with someone who is blind as well, because for many of them, it was probably the first time they had to do that.
Thank you, Elvin, for that very descriptive idea of how that process goes along. And now I'd like to introduce Dan soon. And I'd like to know, Dan, if you could walk us through, I know we've talked about this before, but you've got a really unique perspective and view in relation to the hiring process. So I was hoping you could walk us through a little bit about where inclusion happens and what that looks like from your perspective. So go ahead, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, gladly. This is Dan Samosh, and I just want to start off by apologizing. I seem to have a little tickle in my throat, so I might end up needing to mute myself just to cough a little bit at some point. But when we talk about inclusive hiring, Mike made the really important point earlier, right, that we go through a journey to enter the workplace, that we don't just show up there and end up in a job, but there are many, many steps that happen before we get to that point. And one model, one way of thinking about a career and entry into the workforce is something called the ASA model. It's attraction, selection, and attrition, right? We're first attracted to an organization. We think, oh, I might want to work at this place. We start gathering information about that organization, exploring whether that is truly a place we want to work at. Maybe we talk to someone who's worked there before. Then there's a selection process. That's usually what we think about when we think hiring, right? That's the process of interviewing and so on. And then there's attrition. At some point, you're going to leave an organization. today, for this moment, I'll focus more on the attraction and selection components. And so often when we think about hiring, we think about selection, but really this begins at the point of attraction, an individual saying, do I want to work in a place? So organizations can do a lot of different things to make sure that hiring is inclusive well before that interview, right? Some things are like making accessibility and inclusion information available. That can be on websites, brochures, advertisements, and otherwise. It can also mean preparing well in advance of an interview process for things like accommodation. And that can also be something that is expressed outwardly, right? It doesn't just need to be behind the scenes. You can share with all potential hires, not just individuals who identified as having a disability. We'll be asking about and providing accommodations, letting people know that will happen across each stage of the interview process, not just at one point. Letting people know what some different types of accommodations are that are often provided during interviews and those sorts of processes, which can often, reduce anxiety and make sure that a person knows and is aware of the level of inclusion available within that organization. Now, there's lots of other things that can be done too. Elvin spoke to some of these kind of more small, thoughtful actions that people can engage in to make sure that everyone, whether someone has a disability or not, it feels that they belong because they're being treated as a human. And then there are many other things that an organization can do. One other really, really, really important one prior to the interview is making sure job advertisements and job descriptions are actually inclusive. And so that would be doing things like job description audits, doing task analyses, and these sorts of processes, engaging in them to make sure that people aren't opting out of applying for a job when in fact they have all the requisite skills and requirements to do that job. So, a simple example of this could be a job advertisement that states somebody needs to be able to drive to do a job, when in reality, someone might not actually need to be able to drive. Rather, there are other forms of transportation that can get them where they need to go. And this is unintentionally exclusionary. So that's the attraction side of things, just that first step. And then the second step is around selection, these interview processes and these sorts of things. And often what we can think of when we're kind of going through that part of the hiring process is about creating certain forms of standardization to reduce bias, to reduce reliance on things like stereotypes, but also having enough flexibility in place so that the interview is accessible for the interviewee. So when we think about flexibility, right, often interviews actually test whether someone is a good interviewer. And they don't have much to do with, is this person going to be good at their job? So it's very, very important in those processes, in those selection processes, to make sure we're actually testing, does this person have the skills or the aptitude with our assessments? And there are lots of different little practices here, things like giving someone the questions before an interview, and many other things that can be done. Now, we can also do things, let's say training hiring managers to increase their understanding of disability and taking a strength-based view of everyone who enters an interview with them. Things like giving people the opportunity to engage with people who have different experiences than them. Because often what we see are that hiring managers, and Lorene spoke to this a little bit, hiring managers often don't engage because they're afraid of hiring someone who is in some way different from what they're used to. So having those opportunities for meaningful interaction, meaningful engagement can reduce those kinds of stereotypes. But in reality, we can't always have that. So there are also lots of ways to build interviews so that they reduce bias and reduce reliance on stereotyping and kind of provide these little, like they're called nudges sometimes. And so lots of ways to do that. One example would be when you have an interview, let's say there are 10 questions, we know if you have someone grade a person overall or report on a person overall, that bias is going to creep in more frequently than if we rate people question by question. And then things like if you have a hiring committee, having people make their decisions individually and then have them come together to talk about the decisions that they want. Another quick and really simple, easy way to build structures that are ultimately more inclusive. And the last step of our ASA model is attrition, but we're talking about hiring right now. So I'll conclude there for now.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan, for that. So now I'm just thinking, I want to move on from the hiring process to the building, belonging in the building. Now we've had some, to relationship building. We've had some discussion, maybe, from large events down to very small, large things to small things, but they can make a huge difference. So I want to think a little bit about and maybe discuss more in depth about the relationship building and how important that is for advancement, personal growth, networking, contentment in the workplace, and social relationships. It's key for any organization's success. So Dan, maybe we could start with you here. And if you could just sort of set up our discussion, what we've discussed previously, along the lines of relationship building.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dan.
so, yeah, my pleasure. So I'll talk about relationship building, and especially as it relates to things like career success. So satisfaction with a career, access to career advancement opportunities, and access to really like leadership type roles. So one way of framing, of understanding the factors that facilitate access to career advancement is called the three-legged stool of career success, relating specifically to the career success of persons with disabilities. And those three legs of the stool, or three pillars of the stool, are at three different levels of analysis. So first, we have the individual themselves engaging in things like career self-management strategies. These are behaviors and attitudes that help someone, navigate their career and move through their career, however they so choose. Now, it's not enough, of course, though, to have an individual engaging in behaviors and attitudes. You also need activity at the group level, right? You also need social networks to be engaged. And that'll be the main bulk of what I'll talk about with this question, because we need social networks that are internal and external to the organization. And primarily, we'll also dig into internal to the organization, because we know from lots and lots of research, and as well just stories that people share, that managers and coworkers are extraordinarily important to career success, especially when disability is in the picture, because managers often have an inordinate amount of control over things like accommodation and over things like inclusion, right? We heard about Lorene and Elvin's experiences and how an inclusive hiring manager can make all the difference. Well, similarly, an exclusive hiring manager can make all the difference too. So with that, we also do have one more level, which is the organizational and societal levels, right? And there, what's really critical is to be proactive and flexible in things like policy, management systems, messaging, and at the executive level and so on. So if we are going to dig in a little bit more, though, to that group level, to that social networks level, and especially internal to the organization, while still remembering all these different things are required, it's not enough to just have one small component of this. We can start to talk about social interaction, relationship building in a more formal sense, and also in a more informal sense. So formally, inclusion and belonging starts early, right? I had a participant in a study of mine who talked about their career and, they've been working for a substantial amount of time. And it was several years into their career that their first time an employer asked them, what accommodations do you need? Prior to that, it was always the individual. It was onus on them to request accommodation. And that is a lot of pressure on a person often when they're new, and some people don't want to feel, like they're asking for too much, or they don't know the lay of the land. So something really, really small like that, saying, what accommodations do you need? What can we do? Is incredibly important. And in the case of this individual, they stated, this is the employer I've been with ever since, because they showed them that respect right off the bat. And in that way, right, in a lot of the research that I've done, what's frequently spoken about in this career success, career advancement kind of context is the importance of managers and coworkers seeing the person first, not perceiving the individual as a stereotype, but seeing the individual as a complex person. Disability being something that might be positive, might be negative, might be a neutral experience, but it's an individual experience in many ways. And when the problem arises, if a problem does arise, say around accommodation or access, it's just something that gets fixed. It's not a big deal. It's not perceived as a major problem. It's just something that people work through together, and people are willing to engage in some form of creativity in that process. Now, very importantly, right, everything I've talked about so far is a little bit more formal in nature around things like accommodation and such. But the informal part of work is also very, very, very important. So especially if we're thinking about career success, career advancement, often it's informal social gatherings. Those are the places where conversations happen that result in people potentially getting advancement opportunities or just social networking opportunities. And we know that on average, many people with disabilities have smaller social networks at work than other individuals because there aren't access to these kinds of informal social interactions or informal social activities, these kinds of outings that happen after working hours, this sort of thing. But it's actually a really easy fix to resolve this, to make sure that people have access. And like with many of the points that have been made and will be made, a lot of this is just about talking to people, reaching out and asking, is this space that we're thinking about using accessible? What do we need to do to make our next event accessible? Before booking something, before making plans, talking to people. So that's all that I'll share for this point.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan, for setting us up for that conversation, for that piece of the conversation. I want to move over to an example from Lorene and Elvin now, and maybe we could start with Lorene, if you wouldn't mind just describing that from your perspective, Lorene.
Thanks, Mike. Shortly after Elvin was hired, he had a birthday, which we celebrated with coffee and cake in our boardroom. It was a complete surprise to Elvin, and he later shared with me that it made him feel very welcome. For us, that was a normal sort of thing that we did in our office, but it made a huge difference to Elvin feeling welcome, especially when it happened so soon after he had started. We had in our office potluck events, and it was held on another floor. So navigation to another floor was also new for Elvin. And so I made it a practice to ensure that he had the opportunity to attend the potluck events, which expanded his network with people in the office. In the beginning, I would guide Elvin there, and over time, people started to see, and because of some of the training we had offered, they were more comfortable in just going up to Elvin on his own and saying, "Hey, do you want me to guide you to the potluck?" And it wasn't up to me all the time. So it was really nice because people just started to step up to those things in a natural way. We also always made it a practice in our specific unit to get together, and we did that at least once a year. Although now many of the group members that have come through our unit are now working in different jobs and locations, because we value the social interaction and the connections that we built, we still get together for dinners at least once a year, so quite often twice a year. So those kinds of events and things have made a huge difference to all of us, not just Elvin, but to all of us. Back over to you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Lorene. Thank you for talking to us about relationship building in the community. Now, Elvin, if you could talk to your experience of relationship building in the community.
Sure. Just wanted to start. When I was hired, one of the first questions that Lorene did ask me is, what will I need in terms of accommodation? the computer system equipped with everything that I would need, and the scanner were ready for me when I arrived on the job the first day, and the Braille printer was brought in the middle of the first day. So it was really nice not to have to ask for that, and to not to have to worry that things might not be prepared for me to perform the job on my first day. And it also demonstrated that, as Dan would say, that Lorene is an inclusive hiring manager. During my first year on the job, I was asked to attend meetings that weren't really related to the research study. For example, I was asked to attend the Adapted and Inclusive Functional Team meetings of the Parks, Forestry and Recreation Community Disability Steering Committee, and a meeting of the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee. This increased exposure gave me an opportunity for learning and development, and also was an opportunity for networking because there were a lot of people there that I didn't know. So I had those opportunities through that experience. And I was also asked to deliver presentations on the study to my colleagues. Although Lorene could have easily enough done that, having someone with a disability and with lived experience is more impactful to an audience. So, and it also shows that besides talking the talk about hiring employees with disabilities, we also walk the walk.
Thank you, Elvin. So one thing you and I had discussed a while ago, it was actually the team that had talked about it, or interpreter correction. My team had discussed a while ago, and I wanted to bring it up here, a personal situation that came up last week. And I was hoping to discuss this opportunity for networking and how important that is, especially in informal environments. So my example from last week, there was a project launch at downtown Toronto. And I was interested, so I reached out because I thought it would be a wonderful networking opportunity. So I had reached out, I looked at the agenda, and there were several things on the agenda, but at the very end, there was a networking session, a 1-hour networking session, champagne, hors d'oeuvres, meeting people. So I had asked them if it was acceptable, and I was told yes. So I was expecting it. I still had my doubts that it was going to be fully accessible. Nonetheless, I went, and sure enough, they had an interpreter there on a screen during the presentation. So that agenda was accessible up until the networking session. The screen turned off, no more interpreter. So I thought right away, my opportunity to represent CCRW well is now gone. And it wasn't only that opportunity for myself, but for my organization's success as well. And it was an informal networking session. So that is just one experience that I've had in regards to inclusion and accessibility. But often we don't think of the impact and what full accessibility looks like. So I wanted to throw that example out there for all of you from my own personal experience. I just want to keep track of the time here. Now we're going to move on to the next part. I would like to ask each of you if you could just summarize what belonging means to you. What does belonging look like? We did talk about this a little bit earlier in the session. I'll start with you, Lorene, if you could explain your perspective. What does belonging mean to you?
Thanks, Mike. I think I would say that treating everyone with respect and utilizing the individual talents that each person brings to the whole. I think that's incredibly important. We all have a contribution to make. We should look at the opportunities. I've always tried to look at the opportunities to try new things and use the capabilities within our job environment that everybody has, use all of their capabilities. And I think it's important too to understand people's interests. If we know what people are interested in, Dan spoke about skills earlier and aptitude, and I think interest falls into that too. And then we can try and match what the skills and aptitude and interests are wherever possible in the job. So Elvin spoke to some of that earlier, where I pulled him into some things because he had, I knew he had the skills for it, whether he'd done it before or not, but giving him the opportunity for that personal growth. So those are all things that strike me when you ask that question, Mike.
Thank you, Lorene. Now we'll move on to Elvin.
Yeah, I totally agree, Lorene. And one example of where you made me feel more belonged in the organization happened right in my first year when you were hiring for an administrative assistant position in your office. I was asked to participate in the interview process as a full participant, i.e. asking the questions, filling out the evaluation forms, etc. Gave me an opportunity to use the human resources skills that I learned that I got at university from taking HR courses, and it also showed the interviewees that they have someone with a disability on the panel, because they've likely never encountered somebody that is completely blind. So the whole experience of that was positive, and it also showed, like I said earlier, that we both talk the talk and walk the walk.
Thank you, Elvin. Dan, please go ahead.
Yeah, so to me, true belonging means being treated as a full person, being respected as a full person, and not just as one part of an identity or potentially as a stereotype. And I think to get there are two terms that might be meaningful for this context. And those two terms are being proactive and being flexible. And so to ensure that employees, especially employees with disabilities, experience true belonging, being proactive and flexible is very important. So when I say proactive, what I mean is trying to understand, what issues might arise, what a person needs before the issue arises. So engaging in things like universal design, the comments before about being asked about accommodations first, being asked about informal gatherings first, opportunities for formal and informal networking, making those accessible, and also internally for ourselves, trying to reduce those potential fears of engagement and, maybe saying something wrong, and doing that by learning about different experiences, interacting with people who have different life experiences than our own, and also learning how to empathize. And so within that, considering the role of belonging and respect, it's really important and often forgotten. So if we think about something, let's say like the accommodation process, often we think about the process of accommodation, the actual accommodation itself. But some of my colleagues and I have done some research on, treatments of respect and dignity during the accommodation process. And many others have done, similar related work too. And what we find in our work, we spoke with 10,000, or we did surveys with over 10,000 manufacturing workers in Germany. And the treatment during the accommodation process, not as much the accommodation itself, mattered tremendously to whether someone wanted to leave their job or not. So it's really, really critical, if we want to talk about belonging, to talk about being proactive and being respectful in the workplace. Now, our second point is being flexible. So to Mike's point earlier about his experience, we're never going to get everything right. Even when we are doing our best to be proactive, we're going to make mistakes because we're human. And because we're going to make mistakes, that's where flexibility becomes so important. So after the mistake is made, we learn how to say sorry, we learn how to apologize, and we learn how to apologize in a way that results in action and change. And then we get flexible and we get creative and we say, okay, we've made a mistake. This event right now, this workplace, whatever it might be, is not accessible, and that's not okay. Let's work together, or let's get it to the place that it needs to be. And so I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Thank you for that, Dan. We did have a discussion about this a week ago as well, and I wanted to add one interesting thing about diversity. Depending on the accommodation, of course, for myself, it's sign language interpreters. I use them for a lot of my work and what I do at CCRW. So my next question is, what can employers do to make you feel included or belonged? I did talk about my experience recently, and I think about others with disabilities, and we can be creative to invest in that relationship building with other coworkers. For example, I was trying to find a full-time ASL interpreter to work here at CCRW. Traditionally, at other workplaces, that's often put on the deaf person. Oh, sure, you need an interpreter, find yourself an interpreter. So that's left on my shoulders to do the screening, to do the searching. It essentially becomes my problem, quote unquote. So when that happened, I was thinking, so what should I do? I went out to my team and I let them know that we need a good interpreter, someone who works well with the team, would be a good fit, and that the interpreter is not just for me, it's for the entire team, because they would depend on the interpreter as well. So it's a good idea that all of us discuss this and hire someone qualified for the job. So I did ask some of the team members to be a part of the solution, so to speak, in finding an interpreter and going through that process. And I think by inviting them, it helped them to understand that this is not my need, this is our team's need. And so we were able to solve that issue in that way. And then by being part of the process, they were able to see that this was not easy and that this is a challenge that I see every day. There's a shortage of interpreters. And had they not been brought in on this process, they would be oblivious to the fact that that's what many deaf people live with every day. So this was one of my personal experiences that I've come across. I just would like to wrap up quickly. We'll get to the Q&A. But before we move to that Q&A, I would just like some advice from each of the panelists, regardless of your role, managers, executives. But I'd like you to talk about what you do. One moment for this. One piece of advice that you would give to a manager. I'm going to reinterpret that. So one piece of advice you would give to a manager or executive who's new to this topic and interested in inclusive hiring or building teams where everyone can belong. Looking for advice. We'll start with Dan.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there are a lot of different things that people can do, but from, let's say, a managerial position, one of the most important things that we know, and that's been mentioned before, right, is just how critical the manager is. And managers are really, in a lot of ways, gatekeepers to belongingness, to respect, to access to career success, to access to things like accommodation. And so one thing that we can do broadly organizationally and also at the managerial level is to create structures and opportunities for things like mentorship and sponsorship, because we know that on average, persons with disabilities don't get access to those opportunities, to, learning from someone in a more senior position about how to advance through an organization, or having someone sponsoring them in conversations with other managers or more senior people to help them advance. And if we're thinking especially within the framework of making leadership more inclusive, making career advancement more inclusive, then we know that we need increased representation in leadership beyond kind of a critical mass. for that to occur. And mentorship and sponsorship are one of the key ways to get there, and one of the key barriers that we see now too. So I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Dan. Lorene, go ahead.
Well, it's my turn now to apologize because I actually got ahead of myself earlier. So I'm sorry for that, Mike. I don't know if you want me to go back to belonging or just answer this question, but I'll reiterate this. And if you want me to go back,
I think just, yeah, it's up. We're going to move on to audience questions soon,
Okay,
Lorene. So I
that's
think
fine.
just for the sake of brevity, let's just answer this final question.
Okay. So again, my points around that were really to treat people with respect. And I think part of doing that is just opening the door up and not being fearful, not being afraid to ask when you need help. It's a two-way street. And I think we all have a contribution to make. So Elvin and I at the beginning had, you know, some rough patches, but we worked through them because we kept the conversation open and honest and transparent. And I think that's incredibly important. And it's not always easy to do, right? We can say those things, but it's not always easy to do. And I think we have to push ourselves to do that. Because in the end, it's worth it. The returns are huge when you can push through those things. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lorene. Elvin, we'll give you the final comment for the final question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think the advice that I would give was to see the person rather than the disability first, to be honest and transparent, keep the lines of communication open, and also to be willing to listen to the employee with a disability, because in the end, they know they are the expert on what they need in terms of accommodation.
Thanks, Elvin. So I think the panel time is up.